Welcome, everyone. I'm Sharon Beck, president of the Chicago Club. During the pandemic, we have been providing monthly shows such as trips, comedy, and music on Channel 6. We hope that it will not be too long before we open again in Clubhouse 5. Until then, we will continue our programs and we hope that you enjoy them. So stay safe, stay well, and hopefully we will see each other soon.
Hi, this is Bernie, your travel guy. Welcome to another Chicago Club travel event. I have been patiently waiting for over a year for someone to join me on this empty bus so we can take an in-person trip together. I am finally able to tell you that we are planning a bus trip to a fabulous destination. Last month, I asked the big question, are you ready to travel? And your response was overwhelming. I will soon be sending you an email message inviting you to take our first trip together. The travel date and destination are still a mystery. So that is why I'm calling our first trip a mystery trip. So watch your email inbox and be the first to sign up so you can be assured of getting a seat on this trip. I send out email invitations to over 1,000 village residents, and we only have 50 seats available on the bus. If you're not getting my emails, you need to either subscribe to our mailing list on the club's website or check your email spam folder. Your email program may be putting my messages in the junk folder. I hate when that happens, and so should you, since you will miss out on this fun trip. This month, Hafi, Dorothy, and Carmen are taking you on a virtual tour of the two famous California missions and providing an extensive California history lesson that only Hafi can do. We are looking forward to seeing you very soon on our mystery bus trip. Until then, stay safe and well. I know you will enjoy our show.
Welcome, everyone, to the Chicago Club Travel Show. I'm Dorothy, your host for this afternoon, and we look forward to bringing you another great show. As usual, we are in historic places, and we love sharing with you the history of California. And believe me, today is no exception. We have two great destinations for you, so it's a very historical day. But while I'm on the subject of history, I thought I'd mention today is our 8th show. Believe it or not, we've been doing this for 8 different shows, taking you to all these great places not too far from the village. So we enjoy the historic component, and Hafi is the only one that can bring us the lesson plan and the lesson. So we're doing it for you virtually. Today's destination is great because our first destination is the missions. We're doing the missions today. You may not know that there are 21 missions throughout California, founded by Father Sarah, now Saint Sarah. And we are going to be visiting 2 of those missions, San Luis Rey in Oceanside and San Juan Capistrano in San Juan. They're both beautiful missions, and you're in for a treat because we've got a lot of great things to show you. Hafi is here, and it's important for us to know that we can be able to do this from the village. You know, we talked about getting out and doing some of this. So Mission San Luis Rey is only 45 minutes from the village in Oceanside. And in San Juan Capistrano, we're 10 minutes from the village. So we really hope for these in person because there's nothing like it. We miss you, but we can't wait to share with you the history of the mission. So get ready, and here goes Hafi.
Okay, here we are at one of the most beautiful missions in the California mission system, Mission San Luis Rey de Francia. It is the 18th of the 21 missions. It was built in 1789. You know, the story of the missions is a complicated and a fascinating one. Spain had so many colonies abroad that it basically ignored Upper or Alta California for several hundred years. It was too busy with its colonies in Mexico, Cuba, and South America. But when Spain realized that England and the pirates were moving up and down the coast of California, like Sir Francis Drake, they also realized that the Russians were interested in the fur trade. Spain realized it better start settling Upper California or Alta California. So the King of Spain sent Father Junipero Serra from Mexico to found a chain of missions up and down the coast. And this is one of 21. So in 1769, Father Serra and Gaspar de Portola, who was a military man, arrived in San Diego, and they started an amazing journey. So remember, 100 years before, Cabrillo and Vizcaíno had explored the coast on a ship, but they had never set foot on land. So picture Gaspar de Portola with 63 soldiers and 100 mules going from San Diego all the way up to Northern California. He was supposed to find Monterey, and that would be a great place for a capital of Upper California. So he walked, it took him 3 months to go all the way from San Diego to Monterey, but he never discovered Monterey. He somehow passed it, but he did see the beautiful Bay of San Francisco. By the way, the Native Americans that he met along the way were quite friendly. They gave him fish and nuts and acorns and things that helped them survive. Their biggest problem was lack of water and, believe it or not, attacks by grizzly bears. So can you imagine a European walking up through California, and there were only Native American tribes at that time. There were about 80 indigenous groups who were hunters and gatherers in this area. The Native Americans in this area were called Luiseño Indians. But anyway, Portola comes back to San Diego, and he said, well, I don't exactly know where Monterey is. So the Viceroy sent him back again, and at that time he discovered Monterey. Meanwhile, because he had established this route, Father Serra began to establish missions up and down the coast, which we know as El Camino Real. Now, changing the way of life of the Native Americans, they baptized thousands of Native Americans. They called them neophytes, and they built beautiful missions like this. They learned how to work the land. They became skilled stonemasons and carpenters. But the story is complicated. Sadly, many of them died of infectious diseases. They died of smallpox and the measles. Many of them got diphtheria, so the death toll was absolutely terrible. So on the one hand, Father Serra is a hero of the Catholic Church. He baptized thousands of new adherents to the Catholic faith. But to many Native Americans, it represented a total way of life. And the missions here represent, for California, a total change from a Native American lifestyle to one of ranches and cattle. So the Native Americans that didn't want to live here, if they wanted to go back to their old way of life, it had already been changed. The sheep and the cattle changed the ecology of the land. Many of them did not want to leave because they had learned new trades and they were fascinated by what the Europeans brought. So as you can see, the mission system is our most important legacy of California history. This was one of the biggest missions. It had over 20,000 head of cattle. That's how the missions made their money. They sold the hides. They traded with the ships that went up and down the coast for finished goods. So this was a very prosperous mission. In addition, the death toll was lower because they allowed the Luiseño band of Indians to live outside in their traditional villages. They weren't so crowded. You know, we learned during this terrible COVID epidemic that crowded places is what spread the virus. Here in Mission San Luis Rey, it was so spread out that the Native Americans did not suffer as much. Just think of that. Every mission had 1 or 2 Catholic priests and 6 soldiers. And oftentimes they had as many as 1,000 Native Americans who worked the missions. This mission was so big, it had 2,000 Native Americans who worked here. So the story of the missions is very dramatic. It's how California quickly changed, and there was one more big change. This mission period only lasted about 60 years. Why? Spain became weak and Latin America broke away from Spain. Mexico did not want Spain to have any more power. So they caused the priests to leave. The Spanish priests were forced to leave, and the missions were secularized. And from about 1834 to about 1860, the missions were in terrible disrepair. But this mission, as you can see, has been beautifully reconstructed, and it's one of the only missions where the Franciscan fathers still live. Like Santa Barbara, it's one of the missions that they did not leave. So this to me is a fantastic mission. It's also been designated a National Historic Landmark. That's the highest honor that a historic place can find in the United States. For example, Hearst Castle is a National Historic Landmark. The cable cars in San Francisco, Hotel del Coronado, and beautiful Mission San Luis Rey with its beautiful stepped gable and wonderful cupola. Art historian with us today, Elena Hazelton, and she is a docent here. She was born in Mexico City, lives in California, and she loves the missions, and she's an art historian. So she's going to take us through this beautiful mission. So Chicago Club, here's Elena.
Hello everyone, welcome. Just to give you a brief introduction about Mission San Luis Rey, as already stated, it's the 18th mission out of the 21 missions. It's also the largest mission today, and it used to be the largest during the mission times. The mission at some point occupied about 1 million acres of land, a little less than that, and it was the largest and the most productive of all of the 21 California missions. But I hope you come here to listen a little more stories about Mission San Luis Rey.
Quadrangle.
Yes.
And one of the special things about the mission, and all missions had a quadrangle, and that is where some of the work of the missions occurred. Carpentry, maybe even tanning leather.
Yep.
Yeah, they would butcher the hides, and they would treat the hides here. You can see these beautiful Roman arches. There were something like 52 or even more. It's
32.
32,
Yeah.
Beautifully restored. So let's
32.
walk through.
32 just in the front facade.
Yeah. So look at, it's springtime and we have a lot of beautiful blooms. Can you talk about this bell?
Yes, I can talk about that bell. This is the bell for El Camino Real project, which was a project established by a group, mostly tourism, in the early 1900s, just to trace the road where the original El Camino Real used to go during mission times. As you can see here, the bell has the dates. It says 1769, which is when El Camino Real was established by the Portola expedition, and 1906, which is when these bells were made, just to mark the road, the original road. Sadly, here in Oceanside, the road eventually was expanded into what we call today the I-5, and some of the bells ended up being brought here to the mission, which is where you can see them today. This is the foundation for more arches. Not all areas of the mission are restored. There are some areas that today you will still see in ruins inside the quadrangle and outside the quadrangle, and you can see where ruins of more arches used to be in this entire area.
Yes. Elena, what occurred in this quadrangle that was unusual? They probably did carpentry, but didn't they also do a pseudo bullfight or some sort of games?
They didn't have like traditional bullfighting, but inside this quadrangle was used basically as a bull ring and as a sports stadium, and they used to have sports, and they used Father Perry, who administrated the mission, adapted bullfighting, mostly pick the smaller animals he could get, and he let them run free all throughout this area, just to be more respectful for Native Americans' beliefs about nature and animals and how to be respectful towards nature. Yeah. So this area would have been mostly dirt, flat, no rose garden, and it was used for processions, for bullfighting, for sports, and just everyday activities. Yeah. In certain areas inside the quadrangle, the west wing, which is this area that was rebuilt, it's where all these workshops used to be. The carpenter, the masons, the painters, the people who were learning about sculpture, because they used to bring masters from bigger cities inside the Spanish Empire.
So remember that the mission system changed California forever, and it ushered in after that the Rancho period.
Rancho period, and it also produced most of the industries, the farm industries that we're known for nowadays, from the wine making, from all the olives that are cultivated here, all the citrus, the citrus fruits were brought here by the missions, and it's all of these crops that the Spanish taught the natives how to cultivate in this land. It's very interesting because California, Southern California, has a very similar weather to Southern Europe. It's actually the only part of the world where there is Mediterranean weather. So it was very easy to adapt this entire area to just extend this these things that already existed in Spain, a little bit of the south of France, and Italy.
Yes, and another feature too was that the missions made money by selling hides to the Yankee trader ships that would go up.
Connected the American colonies from Spain to the Philippines in the Pacific. So they have something called the Manila Galleon that connected sailors from Spain. They left the Americas carrying gold and silver produced here in the Americas, mostly Mexico and Peru. They used that gold to buy luxury items, silks, spices, like those beautiful lacquered boxes and screens. And those luxury items came back to the Americas, but before going to the ports where they were going to be shipped and sold, the sailors came to California to buy all those luxury, all those resources that the missions were producing.
Just imagine being here and seeing one of these Spanish galleons coming down the coast with its sails. Why don't we walk down and look at this beautiful rose garden? What's our next stop?
The next stop would be the pepper tree.
Okay, let's go to the pepper tree. So anyway, we're here in front of the pepper tree, and Elena's going to talk about this baby.
Well, we were talking about the Spanish sailors coming from the Philippines and buying all these goods the missions produced. Not all missions were authorized to sell goods to the sailors, by the way. One of those groups of sailors told Father Perry, the administrator, the seeds to plant this pepper tree. And the tree has been growing here for about 200 years. It was originally from Peru, but it became here in California the first California pepper tree.
This one?
This one.
Wow. Oldest pepper tree in California, baby. Roman arches. This beautiful arcade you will find in many of the missions. But in this one, there's actually longer and, in my opinion, more beautifully restored arcades. What is the reason behind this?
Well, the reason behind why these arches were so beautifully restored is because this mission is still a functional mission. This means that there's still people living here, Franciscan. There's a Franciscan community who lives inside this space, and they operate a retreat center. So when the mission was restored and rebuilt, they adapted the space. They were very respectful towards the original style. It's a style actually called mission revival. And they considered how the mission might have looked like in order to restore a functional space. It's not just restoring it to show as a historic site, it's restoring it to make it functional to the 20th and 21st century. That's why it looks worn out, that's why it looks beautiful, that's why you see benches, that's why the Roman arches are beautifully painted, that's why the roof was adapted as well, but you can see it's actually wooden beams the way it might have been 200 years ago. Today we have other things like electricity, electric lightning, there's fire protection.
Fire suppression, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not exactly original, but it was restored and rebuilt to make it functional nowadays and still make it look authentic
as it looked. Yeah, very good. Okay, so Helena was talking about the mission revival architecture. Remember the old Taco Bells with the rounded gable and the bell? That's mission revival. A lot of train stations in the United States, that became very popular in the early 1900s. Look, for example, that's a beautiful example of mission revival. Right below the cross, you can see the rounded gable top and the bell. That's classic mission revival. And these beautiful, these beautiful arches, the King of Spain actually mandated in the Law of Indies that all towns would have these arcades and a plaza, which makes Mexican towns so fun to visit. Love that.
This little area is like the heart of the mission, in my opinion. This is where the reconstruction started. In the late 1800s, 1892, a group of Franciscans from Mexico came here. They requested permission to establish a school in what would be the ruins of Mission San Luis Rey. And the idea at first was to restore just a little bit of the mission to make it livable for them and to make the school. So they took part of the south wing, part of the east wing, and they built like a mini quadrangle, a mini square inside the bigger space that used to be part of the larger quadrangle. And they built like a mini mission inside the mission itself in this beautiful style that it's Mission Revival, with the same arches, with the fountains, with the tiles on the roof. And this is mostly where everything is organized today. This is like the heart of the modern day mission. One of the things that characterizes Mission San Luis Rey Church is its shape. It's a cruciform shape or layout. It has a transept. There were not that many churches built with this layout in the mission era in California. There were only two: San Juan Capistrano, which was destroyed in the earthquake of 1812, and then San Luis Rey, a construction that was finished actually in 1815 after that earthquake. The church is mostly neoclassical, with a little bit of decoration that reminds us to other styles, like the Baroque or the Rococo, for example, in that arch that you see that has a shell shape.
Yeah, and I notice the two columns with the
Corinthian.
The Corinthian columns with the rounded form up above the pediment. That's neoclassical. It's formal. It's not. It doesn't have as many circular ovals as Baroque. And that's why a lot of Mexican churches had this. And her point was, a lot of the other missions, it was one long room. They didn't have room to make the layout like a cross.
And not just the room, they didn't have the resources. The idea behind the mission was to eventually grow their church into something a lot more, a little more original, or a little more following the actual rules that the Vatican used to have. One of the rules the Vatican had is that a proper church should have a cross-shaped layout, whether it was Greek cross or a Latin cross. It should be facing some certain points, but there were exceptions. Missions were the exception.
Yeah, but it seems to me, because this mission was so prosperous and they raised so much cattle, they had enough money to lay the church out like a cross.
Exactly. This is actually the third church. There was originally here a small chapel that eventually was expanded, and by 1810, 1811, that the entire mission was built, that the mission was prosperous. That's when they decided to build this big, massive, beautiful church, because they had the resources for that. They built the largest of all California churches, the tallest, and the largest dome. Just imagine this. The Native Americans who worked building this mission had no idea what materials were used in Europe for churches. I'm referring to materials like marble or tiles. And just with a brief description by the Franciscans and the architect, they were able to copy or recreate the texture of materials like tile in surfaces on the walls. For example, all this reminds us to tile that you can see in churches in Southern Europe. This technically is something that we call Moorish style. This church, even though the construction is basically neoclassical, it has elements from other styles as well. This would be Moorish. This is where you can see the tiles more clearly. And there's also tidbits and little bits of, for example, red velvet curtains right next to the roof, or very close to the roof actually. These Solomonic columns that are very traditional in the Baroque, that were translated as just like waves in these columns. And the classical, neoclassical actually elements, like the very beautiful, just straight columns in the altar. You will see the Corinthian columns, but these are just very basic Doric style columns that are very classical, very Roman, with these little tidbits of intricate decoration that reminds us to churches in Southern Europe. There are those tidbits that I was mentioning, the shell-shaped arch, which is very traditionally Baroque. It's actually very late. In the 1700s, there was this new style that in Spain was translated as churrigueresco. It's basically a Spanish version of the famous Rococo from the French, and they use this type of shapes a lot, mostly recreating shells, recreating these organic forms from nature itself.
Okay, almost all the missions have a cemetery associated with them. The one in San Juan Capistrano is called El Campo Santo. And in many cases, they buried the Native Americans in unmarked graves. And when they did the reconstruction of the Serra Chapel, they had to have an art historian and a representative of the native tribes because that is sacred ground.
Yeah.
Elena will now explain this beautiful cemetery. It looks quite different.
It's a lot different than the one in San Juan Capistrano. First, it was bigger, and it would make sense because this mission was larger than San Juan Capistrano. There were more people associated to San Luis Rey than San Juan Capistrano. The same thing happened. Mostly the Native Americans would be buried here with unmarked graves. Maybe they would put just a cross made out of wood, but that was it. When the mission was abandoned, it was actually sold as a ranch for political favors, and the owner of the mission became the brother of the last Mexican governor, Pio Pico, and his family is actually buried here. Because even when the mission was abandoned, the Catholic people around the community, because the space is technically sacred, they would still come here and bury their people. So we have a few graves in that area from the 1850s, 1860s with famous names in California: the Bandini family, the Bernard family, the Pico family from the Rancho era, the Mexican Rancho era. Most of them are buried here, and the cemetery was closed back then. We have a very big cemetery today because the mission is still active, and we still have a cemetery office, and everyone from any denomination can come here and get a plot of land or a little niche to rest after after they die. The cemetery today is expanding. It's actually much larger than just this small space. When you're done with the tour, if you come here, you can also explore the bigger areas of the cemetery. But you can see like the difference between the older graves with the crosses from the 1800s and the more open, newer part of the cemetery with just flat graves. Now it's 12.
Yes.
The graves are marked, and you can see the difference between that traditional old Catholic cemetery and the newer, more modern addition that was made just a few decades ago.
So the oldest gravesite here is from maybe 1850?
There's one from 1860. I think it's the one right next to the memorial. This is Magdalena Pico,
Oh, wow.
JC Pico, which were ranchers. By then there were ranchers. We also have this Indian memorial, which is technically the oldest memorial we have here in the cemetery. This was built by Father Perry himself in the 1830s after the Mexican secularization era. He was one of the many people, one of the many Spanish people that were told that they had to go back to Spain. And before going back to San Diego to take his ship, he built this Indian memorial just because he knew that the original unmarked graves might have get lost when the mission was abandoned, and he wanted a reminder of the people who were buried here before everything else was destroyed. This is one of the most important things the mission still preserves. Why? Because Father Perry was the only Spanish person in California to live very aware and very conscious of what it meant, a reminder of the people who actually worked and built missions like San Luis Rey.
What a great thing for him to do. I also remember when Mexico broke away from Spain in 1821, the missions were secularized about 10 years later. And the new Mexican government didn't want the Catholic Church to have too much power.
It was the Spanish. They were not that worried or that concerned about the Catholic Church. They were more concerned about Spanish institutions like the missions that were administered by Catholic priests from Spain that would serve first the Vatican and then the King of Spain.
Yeah, that's right, rather than Mexico.
Exactly.
So Father Perry, when he was asked to leave as part of this secularization process, I read that the natives accompanied him to the coast to say goodbye. And some of them were so loyal to him, they went all the way to San Diego, and he left from San Diego to go back to Spain. And how great it was that he built this memorial to the Native Americans that he loved so much, and as a reminder of who actually built this mission. Thank you. Okay, we're here by the statue of Father Junipero Serra, who is now made a saint by the Catholic Church. And as you know, streets and schools are named after Father Serra, probably the most famous Spaniard in California history.
Yes.
So if you could give us a little more background, that'd be great.
Well, most of you might know Father Serra because very recently the Pope came to the United States. I think it was 2012. And he celebrated Mass, making him a saint. And that was extremely controversial because nowadays we tend to see history as black and white, when in reality is just as what it is today, just different shades of gray. We do things that might be good for us, but that doesn't mean that what we're doing is good for everyone else. That was the same case here. Father Serra was following rules. He was following what he was told to do. He was following his beliefs about what he was supposed to do. And that resulted in something that came with a lot of success, but also a lot of contradictions. And most people tend to focus today on those negative elements and contradictions that, yes, led to things that we're not proud of, but at the same time, he was the founder and the person who began and the person who established what California is today, with the farming and the ranching industry, with the way that California is still building its own houses. All of that came and comes starting from the missions. The missions are the foundation of what we call modern day California, and we would technically like Native Americans to be part of that, as they were at some point in this particular mission history. We know Native Americans in California are very different to one another. There are hundreds, or back then there were hundreds of different tribes, and each mission had a different way to approach natives and native history. In Mission San Luis Rey, there was always respect towards the Franciscans and the Luiseño community in the area, and we try to keep that tradition alive today. The Luiseños are still part of our community, and we like to listen to them. And there's still some celebrations, like their powwows that are part of what we celebrate here. The powwow is celebrated here in our parking lot, and we like to keep that communication alive. We don't have to focus on just negative aspects or positive aspects. We can accept that there were mistakes, but at the same time, we wouldn't be what we are today without people like Father Serra.
At the prickly pear cactus, and there's an animal, an insect that lives here called a cochinilla. And the Native Americans would scrape out the remnants of the little bug, and when you squish them, there was this beautiful dye. You can see it's kind of a deep purple red.
Yes.
And they used it in their clothing and their dyes. Maybe paints?
Maybe paints.
Yeah.
There's a story of
so you can,
So red dye was a very expensive dye in medieval Europe. It was impressive how expensive dyes like red or blue or purple could be in medieval Europe. And there's a story of when Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire, because this is technically an Aztec dye, the name is Aztec. When he arrived to Tenochtitlan, to Mexico City, he was just impressed by the amount of red, because even the temples were painted red, and he wanted to know where the dye was coming from. So eventually all the Spanish conquistadores found out that the natives were scraping the cactus to get that red dye. So he thought that was fascinating. And he sent that back to Spain, and the king just said, well, start producing it, start taking the cactus everywhere.
Wow.
Yes. And that's what the Spanish people did. They took the prickly pear cactus, originally from central Mexico, and they took it everywhere to their empire. Today, for example, here in California, we have a lot of prickly pear cactus because the missions came here with the cactus to produce the cochinilla. One of the most important centers that produces cochinilla today are the islands in the Mediterranean, Mallorca, the Balearic Island,
off of Spain.
They produce a lot of cochinilla as well. And the islands in Africa that were from the Portuguese and the Spanish Empire as well, they produce cochinilla today too. It's a dye that it's still used today. It's used in the food industry and in the cosmetics industry as a different name. You will see it listed as different names, one of them red number 4. But it's even Starbucks at some point used it to dye their pink drinks.
And I want to tell you that my wife and I went to Oaxaca. We went to one of the indigenous communities where these wonderful weavers would make these beautiful rugs, and they used the dye from the cochinilla, and they gathered. Now, is this a bug or is this part of the, what it's?
It's the plague of the cactus.
It's the plague.
It's a bug that grows on the cactus, yes.
Okay, so this proves I voted. This is a native poppy to California.
Oh,
this is the
that's
Matilia poppy. It looks like a fried egg. It grows in the Channel Islands, and it's a drought tolerant. And it is so beautiful. Look at the flowers. They look exactly like a fried egg. And if you go to the beautiful town of Ojai, California, they have an entire street named after this poppy. Look at how beautiful they are. They get over 8 feet tall, and to me, it shouldn't be the state flower. We have the golden poppy, but the Matilia poppy is drop dead gorgeous. We are at the lavanderia, which is the laundry shop of the mission. Every mission had to have water.
Yes.
You could not build a mission if it wasn't close to a stream or a river. So they would build a ditch called a zanja. And this is where the zanja was, and this is where they washed their clothes. And Elena is going to give us some more detail.
Well, technically the water here, according to records and according to travelers that came here in the 1820s, they talk about an aqueduct that connected this area to the San Luis Rey River, about a 10-minute walk from where we are. There were a series of zanjas or pipes and aqueducts that connected all this area to the river, and this area was full of water. Today it's in ruins, but imagine this area full of water with the women doing their laundry here. They also had a space where they could shower or bathe right next to the staircase. There's like 2 artificial caves made out of rocks, which is where they could where they could have privacy, where the water would spout. It was collected over there, it was filtered, and then it spouted again from the gargoyle, from the mouth of the 2
Oh, look at the gargoyle.
That was the water spout. It filled the entire area.
Wow.
The women would be kneeling here doing their laundry, and then the water was collected and it went through a last filtration in this zanja, in this duct. It was collected all the way from the kiln. In those arches it was filtered, and it was collected on another big container and then reused to irrigate the garden. This is where the sunken garden used to be. It was the orchard of the mission, and it was enclosed by an adobe fence too. Today that fence is gone. The area is just part of the mission lands, but there's nothing going on here, and at some point we want to bring that, at least a demonstration of what the orchard used to be.
I think that would be beautiful to bring it. When the Spanish arrived in 1769, there were about 80 different native peoples that lived in California. There was no dominant group like the Aztecs or the Mayans in southern Mexico. So you can see the map here, the Chumash in the Santa Barbara area, the Tongva in Los Angeles, but here down in the San Diego area is the Luiseno Indians. And they spoke a language called Shoshonen. And they were excellent basket makers. You can see the baskets, because in native cultures, baskets were very important since they didn't have a wheel to transport items and also to store items. So you can see some of their basketry. The Native Americans also used a lot of medicinal plants. They gathered acorns. They used elderberry for tea. The climate here was probably wetter. You can see the tules that they would actually build small boats in. Oh, this is interesting. So the typical mission was in a quadrangle form, and this is the plan of the San Luis Rey mission. The quadrangle, which you will see later, is where they did a lot of the work, and they actually had festivities, and you can see the model here. It is really a beautiful layout. The Roman arches were also mandated by the Spanish government, and they have been used constantly throughout Southern California as part of the mission style. This is Father Perry. He was the Spanish priest assigned to this mission, quite beloved by the native peoples, because when he was forced to leave, when the missions were secularized, some of them followed him all the way to the coast and didn't want him to leave. One of the important ways that the missions made money was by selling hides. And when they butchered the cattle and they rendered the hides, they were able to get soap and tallow. And the tallow was used in the candles. And then they sold the hides, which were called California banknotes, to the traders. The cooking was often using, obviously, local wood, and they often cooked outdoors. And the Luiseño Indians, they used to be hunters and harvesters. They learned a lot of new trades. I wonder, by the way, when garlic was brought to California, because that's become a real staple. Here's some of the garments that Father Perry would wear when he said Mass, and they converted the natives to the Catholic faith. They were called neophytes. The Catholic order which converted the Native Americans to Catholicism were the Franciscans. The Jesuits were in Baja California, and the Jesuits were actually kicked out of Baja because they were deemed to be too political. The Franciscans had a better relationship with the Spanish crown. And because the Spanish fathers couldn't speak the native languages or vice versa, they often had to use colorful graphics to teach the natives about the Catholic religion. Here's the ubiquitous picture of the Lady of Guadalupe, the Saint of Guadalupe. She appeared to a peasant in Mexico in 1542 and produced these roses. And she was an angel or messenger of God, and told this Mexican peasant his name was Juan Diego, to build a church where she appeared to him. And she appeared 2 other times. So throughout Mexico, people worship the Virgin of Guadalupe. She is their patron saint, and you can see the radiant angel light coming from around her. The Lady of Guadalupe. This room portrays the importance of Mission San Luis Rey as an agricultural center. They raised 22,000 head of cattle, 27,000 head of sheep, goats and pigs and mules and horses. And the Native Americans did almost all the hard work. And you can see the metates, where they would grind acorns and other grains. And as I said before, the hides were so important to make money for the missions. Remember from one of our previous shows, Richard Henry Dana from New England came around the Horn to California, and they were after hides because the hides were used, sent back to New England, and they were made into hats and boots and belts. They were called California banknotes. This picture of Mission San Luis Rey, you can see the arches. It was famous for the tremendous number of Roman arches. And you can see there's not a lot of trees in the area, which explains why adobe was so important in construction. This is a picture of the Zacatecan Franciscan friars. Zacatecas is an important capital in central Mexico. So they came from Mexico to live and worship here. This is an interesting drawing. This is Father Perry, the Spanish priest who was forced to leave the mission when it was secularized in 1833. So you can see, according to this, the Native Americans are rushing out to the boat because they don't want him to leave. That's how much they adored him. This is an important little graphic here because remember, when Mexico broke away from Spain, they took the power of the missions away from the Catholic Church and away from the Spanish. So many of the missions, like San Juan Capistrano, fell into disrepair. You can see the picture of the soldier there. They were called soldados de cuero. They wore thick leather jackets to prevent an arrow from coming in. You can see the soldier with the leather uniform. Yeah, look at, yeah.
Title to certain lands of the mission at San Luis Rey. On March 18, 1865, less than a month before his assassination, President Abraham Lincoln affixed his official signature to the title deeds and thereby returned the property of Mission San Luis Rey to the Catholic Church. Displayed here is the original document signed with President Lincoln's full signature. While most of the mission lands had been divided and became ranchos by means of land grants after 1835, the mission itself was left little, even with protection. In 1846, after the last friar had passed away, the Mission San Luis Rey property was sold by Governor Pio Pico for $2,437. There was more than 12 years from the time the petition was filed by the bishop of the Diocese of Monterey, the state Catholic conferred on his successor, title to certain lands of the mission at San Luis Rey. On March 18, 1865.
So remember, after the Spanish priests were forced to leave, the missions were largely abandoned, and the governor, Pio Pico, sold the land to relatives and to soldiers and to other people, and California entered the period called the Rancho period. And those people in California who were of Mexican descent, born in California, were called Californios. And the Rancho period would last from 1834 until 1850, when California became a state. So this is a picture of the powwow that the Luiseño Indians still have every year at the Mission San Luis Rey. And they live, of course, in the area. You might have remembered the 1950s TV series Zorro, which in English means fox. It was done by Disney. It was filmed here at Mission San Luis Rey. Zorro was a Californio who was kind of like a Robin Hood, who would steal from the rich and help the poor. He might have been Joaquin Murrieta. Murrieta, by the way, in Riverside County, is named after him. He was a Californio who got a band of his cohorts, and they actually robbed some people and tried to give things back to the poor. but Zorro was filmed here, and it might have been Joaquin Murrieta, who in some books is called a bandit. But it turns out that Murrieta's family was actually attacked violently, and that's why he went on a rampage. Okay, Chicago Club, we have visited so many beautiful places. The most famous of them are National Historic Landmarks like Hotel del Coronado. Here's the plaque. I always look for the plaque when we went to Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The Space Facilities Center is a National Historic Landmark. So this beautiful mission, which is called the King of the Missions, is so important historically, and it's so beautiful. It was declared by the federal government as a National Historic Landmark in 1970. Mission San Juan Capistrano applied but did not get that status. This shows you how beautiful this mission is. One of the beautiful things about Mission San Juan Capistrano is the landscaping. There's a group called the Garden Angels who come once a week and they pick the plants, they trim them, they fertilize them, and I think of all the missions I've gone to, these are some of the most beautiful gardens. Take a look at our state flower, the California poppy. We have some beautiful roses. We have in the background a butterfly bush, and you'll be seeing a lot of monarch butterflies. In the foreground, we have Mexican bush sage, which the hummingbirds absolutely love. And this is early June, and this is the prime bloomage of this. We have this blue statice, which is a dry flower that lasts almost 3 months. It's absolutely beautiful. This is another drought-tolerant plant. It's called a garda, and I've actually planted them in my front yard. So just take a look at this beautiful, they call San Juan Capistrano the jewel of the missions, and one of the reasons is the beautiful landscaping. The oak tree is, of course, a native. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to the cross and the rounded gable. The rounded gable was brought by the Spanish Franciscan missionaries, and that style became very popular. So if you see a building with a wall that's rounded at the top, that's Mission Revival. So this is a fun story. In Chicago, they had a World's Fair, and the California Pavilion had the rounded gable. It looked like a mission. And it started to become a very popular style for the next 20 years. Santa Barbara has the mission gable. The Presidio in San Francisco, Hotel Laguna, is also Mission Revival. But my favorite, and unfortunately they discontinued it, is Taco Bell. You will notice the famous rounded gable. That's Mission Revival architecture. As you know, President Nixon lived in San Clemente, and he loved to come to San Juan Capistrano. He ate at El Adobe a lot. He played golf at Shore Cliffs. He visited the mission. This plaque is to commemorate his visit with his wife. And up above are some of the mission bells. The ones on the right are actual original mission bells. The ones on the left are replicas. The mission bells were very important because in those days there were no pagers or cell phones or telephones. So the bells were used to commemorate mass, funerals, and meetings. The bells were I would say, the telephone of that time period. Okay, we are in the Old Stone Church of Mission San Juan Capistrano. It was one of the largest churches of all the 21 missions, and it was built of stone. It was started in 1797, and sadly they had a terrible earthquake. But let me show you the photo of what the Old Stone Church looked like. Notice it had vaulted ceilings, the dome ceilings, and it had the typical cruciform design with the long nave and the transept. So we are right under the transept. And sadly, in 1812, they had a terrible earthquake during Mass, and 40 Native American neophytes, recently drawn to the Catholic faith, were killed that tragic morning. So this is a very sacred place, and this is the altar of the Old Stone Church. You can see the insets. Some of those statues have been recovered, and we'll see them later in a museum. You can see the large vaulted ceilings, and you can see up above, you can see a keystone. There's actually a design that looks a little bit like a plant or flower. I haven't been able to find out what it symbolizes, but it's absolutely a beautiful, sacred space. And as we walk up a little closer, You can see on the left the sacristy where the Franciscan fathers would put on their garments ready to say Mass. And you can see the transept. This is certainly a long cross. You can get an idea how large this church was. And because it was built of stone and there was no iron to reinforce it, it sadly came tumbling down. You can also see some of the stones and original bricks. And then if you come back to this side, you can see up above, see the iron bar. That's where they reinforced it to prevent future damage from a possible earthquake. But the noise and the dust might have scared some of the famous swallows away. Okay, when the Old Stone Church came down, it was in ruins for many, many decades. But in the early 1900s, a group came in called the Landmarks Club, and they tried to save the ruins. And what they did is they actually put some cement over the adobe to prevent it from washing even further. Because as you know, adobe is mostly mud, and it'll come down with the rain. So you can see where they preserved some of the walls by simply covering them with a coating of cement. Here's a replica of the Old Stone Church. It took 8 years to build. There's a large tower here where we're standing, and then you can see the nave, the long nave. You can see how large this church was. It was called the Acropolis of the Missions. Extremely large. By the way, they actually have concerts in here in the summer in this beautiful space. This is a Dudleya, one of the few native succulents to the chaparral along here. And you can see Dudleya when you walk around these foothills, and they like to grow in rocks. And the garden angels are so smart, they put rocks around them. And this is a mallow. This is a beautifully subtle desert flower that I absolutely love. Okay, this is a hollyhock, and they grow really well here. By the way, Frank Lloyd Wright, his most famous house in LA is called the Hollyhock House because Ellen Barnsdale loved hollyhocks. So he made a stylistic design of a hollyhock, but look at that beautiful long stem. And they seem to grow well here because of the garden angels. Oh, here, Dorothy, here they are again. Matilia poppies. These are the beautiful Matilia poppies, the largest poppy, native poppy of California. They grow on the Channel Islands, and you can see they look kind of like a fried egg. Some of these plants get to be over 8 feet tall. I've never successfully grown one, but I bet I could. I really love this plant. It's called a red yucca. It puts out these long shoots. It's a desert plant, and these shoots will last about 3 months. So you can see why they call it a red yucca because of the flower. So this is a statue of Father Junipero Serra. He was born in Mallorca, Spain, was sent to Mexico, worked his way up the hierarchy, came up through Baja California, and then was assigned to establish missions. This is the 7th of the 21 missions. He passed away after founding 9 of the 21 missions. So here's Father Serra with a neophyte. A neophyte means a newly baptized member of the Catholic faith. Now, as you know, Pope Francis beatified Father Serra, and he became a saint for his tremendous support of the Catholic faith in the New World. That was also very controversial among Native Americans because of the diseases brought and the change of lifestyle. It was opposed by many Native American groups. So they actually removed a statue from the other part of the garden. But you cannot deny Saint Sarah's legacy was very, very powerful. One of the significant things about this mission is we know that Saint Sarah actually gave Mass here. So we can see his handwriting, a page from his confirmation register. We can actually also see the baptismal shell that he used in the baptismal process. So he actually said Mass here at San Juan Capistrano, and we're about to go into the chapel. So this is a nice model of the layout of Mission San Juan Capistrano. You can see the old stone church, which sadly was destroyed in the 1812 earthquake. You can see the area, which is the chapel, but then you can see the large quadrangle, which we're going to go into in a few minutes. That's where most of the work of the missions were done. Almost all the missions had a large quadrangle where they tanned hides, where they had rodeos, where they did carpentry and building. That was very active. The soldiers were usually housed right in front of the mission for protection. This mission was only attacked once by pirates. Now this is a diagram. You can see that the mission fell into disrepair for many decades after the earthquake. And Mexico broke away from Spain in 1821, and the missions were secularized. The Catholic Church did not want Spain to have any more power in California, so they forced the Catholic priests to leave. Here's the Mexican flag, and you can see after the Spanish period, we had the Mexican Rancho period, and many of the names of Southern California come from these Mexican ranchos. If you knew the governor, you could inherit land, especially if you were a family, a soldier, or you were a friend of the governor. You can see places like Rancho Santa Margarita, Rancho de Santa Ana, Rancho Santiago, Rancho La Habra. These are names that we live with and live on today. This is a great California story over here. An Englishman named John Forster married the sister of Mexican Governor Pio Pico. When he married the sister, Isadora, he inherited 20,000 acres. So he ended up being one of the largest ranchers, and he ended up buying the mission for $745, which is quite a bargain. But in today's dollars, of course, it's a little more. And then this is actually very interesting. The way the missions made money is after they slaughtered the cattle and they rendered the hides, they made candles and tallow and soap. They sold the hides to New England traders, and they were called California banknotes. So that's one of the major ways that the missions made money, but they also changed the environment so that the Native Americans could not go back to their original lifestyle. One more thing is very interesting. The Mexicans who lived in California were called Californios, and they were supposedly very great ranchers, great horsemen, and they had these wonderful parties called fandangos, and they would dress in their fancy ranchero clothing. They would have bullfights, and that was a very romantic lifestyle. In 1865, Abraham Lincoln, shortly before he was assassinated, signed a proclamation giving the missions back to the Catholic Church, because after all, they built them and he thought that was only appropriate. So then, San Juan Capistrano was controlled by the Catholic Church, but then they had to rebuild. And I'll tell the story of that rebuilding. And that are close to where we live. We have Rancho Niguel, owned by Juan Avila, later owned by Louis Moulton. Rancho Mission Viejo, owned by Estudillo, later owned by Olivera, and then John Forster bought it, who I just talked about it. So you can see up on the map Rancho Niguel, and you can also see Rancho San Joaquin, where Irvine is. But look at Laguna Beach. Laguna Beach was never a Mexican rancho. And for that reason, as we discussed in an earlier show, artists and families could settle there, and it wasn't owned by the Mexican government. This is the quadrangle where the work of the mission was done, and you can see the theme we saw in Mission San Luis Rey, the Roman arches, the rounded arches of Italian fame, which were mandated by the King of Spain as part of the architecture. And these beautiful arcades are very common in Southern California architecture, as well as in Mediterranean countries. But look at this beautiful, beautiful quadrangle. Imagine 1,000 neophytes who had been baptized would work here as they built the mission and repaired it. And they were allowed to actually live in adobes outside. But this beautiful quadrangle, I think, is one of the most beautiful of any of the 21 missions. And of course, the Garden Angels do such a beautiful job with landscaping. I salute them. Okay, we're about to enter the Serra Chapel, which was built in 1778, one of the oldest buildings in California. I don't want to brag, but I was married here. Before it became a museum, they allowed people to be married here, and my wife was a parishioner in the San Juan Capistrano area, and I, being a Presbyterian, was considered good enough to be married here. So this is a very sacred and beautiful chapel. And as we walk in, my voice will be a little hushed, and I'll describe it as we go through. First of all, you can see it's one long nave. Many of the chapels did not have the cruciform pattern that we described in San Luis Rey and the Old Stone Church. They were simply a long room with a flat roof, but nevertheless very beautiful. On the right, we have St. Peregrine's Chapel. St. Peregrine was the patron saint of certain diseases like cancer. So people who were afflicted would come here and pray for their loved ones or for their own health. The pictures on the wall are the Stations of the Cross. And we once again see the Native American artwork that they have restored. Apparently, the only color that the Native American people didn't have was a blue color. That was something that the Franciscan fathers brought. Now the centerpiece is the altar. It's over 425 years old, and it was brought from Barcelona, Spain. And it's wood gilded in gold. And they brought it to Los Angeles in 1906 in 480 pieces. They had to reassemble it, but you'll notice something unusual. It's too tall for the roof, the ceiling. So they had to knock out the ceiling and raise the ceiling 6 feet to be able to fit this beautiful altar. Now you can see in the center at the top is Saint John of Capistrano. He is an Italian saint. On the right is Saint Michael. On the left is Saint Francis of Assisi. And supervising everybody up above Saint John Capistrano is God himself. So this is an absolutely stunning altar. So I stood here in 1983 as my beautiful bride Maria came down the altar, and the organ was playing Ave Maria. And I said to myself, Bill, you are a lucky man. So we're in the Campo Santo, the mission cemetery, and believe it or not, over 3,000 Native Americans are buried here. In those days, it wasn't the custom to have marked graves. They buried the bodies horizontally, and they did not put markers in. Some missions have markers, many do not. The large monument here is to Father O'Sullivan, one of the early Catholic priests who really helped save the mission. You can also see the outside of Serra Chapel. You can see those 4 wires coming down. Those are to prevent damage during an earthquake. So when they put those in, they had to have an archaeologist and a tribal member of the Hashiman people, because this is a very sacred site. Okay, we're in the beautiful quadrangle of the mission. As I explained before, this is where the mission work was carried out. They were tanning the hides and building and growing things. They even had rodeos here and bullfights. One of the things I love about this mission, besides the wonderful guardian angels, is that they use this for parties. Corporations can come in here for their annual party. In the summer, they have a concert series to raise money for the mission. They have they have a Bee Gees cover band, for heaven's sakes, in one of the oldest landmarks in California. They have a battle of the mariachis. So to me, a museum should be a living, fun place, and Mission San Juan Capistrano does that church, but it's a little bit similar. But there's a fun story behind it. When the Catholic Church went in to get approval from the San Juan Capistrano government, it was too tall. It was a violation of the variance and the zoning laws. So the Catholic Church said, if you can't grant God a variance, who gets a variance? So the city of San Juan Capistrano allowed that church to be taller than the zoning code would normally allow. This is one of my favorite trees in California. It's called a strawberry tree, and it does have little strawberries on them. I've never eaten one. I don't know if they're edible. But I love it. The bark is almost like a manzanita bush, which is grown throughout the Chaparral area at higher elevations. But Southern California needs more trees, and they need drought-tolerant trees because we need to cool our climate. If you plant trees in your backyard, the temperature goes down substantially. And this strawberry tree is one gorgeous tree. My second favorite tree is the desert tree called the Palo Verde. You'll notice it has little tiny leaves because it cannot afford to give up moisture in the desert. And it's called Palo Verde, which means green stick. So the town of Palos Verdes is green sticks. And it is has a nice yellow flower, and it grows wonderfully in areas like Palm Springs. That is the fabulous Palo Verde tree. I'm a big fan. Okay, so please remember, in 1821, Mexico broke away from Spain, and they wanted to take control of the missions. So the missions were secularized. The Catholic Church was some of their power was taken away. In fact, it went even so far as the Mexican government almost sold some of the mission buildings at auction. Look at what bad shape the mission was after it was secularized. So the mission fell into disrepair, but remember, Abraham Lincoln passed a proclamation giving it back to the Catholic Church. And this is the part of the story that I love. So starting in the early 1900s, a group of people called the Landmarks Club, they were mostly from Los Angeles, came in and they said, we need to preserve this beautiful legacy of missions and Spanish colonial architecture. And this gentleman, Charles Lummis, was a journalist. He actually walked from Ohio. He walked as a publicity stunt, and he got a job at the LA Times. And he came down to San Juan Capistrano, and he helped preserve the mission. Here's another picture of Charles Lummis. And the reason I care so much about him is that he did so much to preserve the missions and the legacy, for example, Santa Barbara's beautiful Spanish colonial architecture. But here's part of the story that I find fun. When I was a little kid, in the early 60s, there was a man who lived on my street. His name was Jordan Lummis, and he had a lot of Native American baskets. And I said, Mr. Lummis, why do you have that stuff? Oh, my dad helped save the missions. My dad loved the Native Americans. So Charles Lummis and the Landmarks Club, along with Father O'Sullivan, helped save the missions. In the 1920s, San Juan Capistrano was discovered by Hollywood. After all, you had a crumbling romantic mission that was making a comeback. You also had the swallows coming back. These are cliff swallows that fly all the way from Argentina all the way to San Juan Capistrano. Talk about animal instincts. There's a good example of it. And Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks came and did a wedding here. So many movie stars would come down to San Juan Capistrano because it was such a romantic place. And Hollywood was only an hour and a half away, so it made sense that Hollywood would do filming here and come here for rest and relaxation. So the Native American people that lived here were called the Ahashiman tribe. And they were close to the Gabrieleños. When they were baptized, they were called the Juaneños. So when they were baptized, they were given a Spanish name. So we can see Geogonio Lias is the Spanish name, where the Ahashiman name was Coromin. Quinavan became Maria Dolores. Chiliqui became Cesarca. So you can see how when they were baptized, they were given Spanish Catholic names. And this basket here is, I think, important. It sometimes took 400 hours to make a basket. These baskets had to be watertight because they would often put acorns in there to leach out the tannins. They used these baskets for carrying things, also for gifts and ceremonies. So this is one of the hides of the cattle in the area. You can see the branding cap. Now, during the Rancho area and during the Mission era, butchering the hides, making tallow for candles and soap was important to the economy. But then they sold the hides. And Richard Henry Dana and many of the Yankee traders would come in on boats. They would load the hides down and they would throw them over the cliff in Dana Point, and they would go around the Horn and they would become leather and shoes and hats. Remember, they were called California banknotes. We are in another one of the great history rooms, and this is one of the wine vats. This was an indoor wine vat, and there was an outdoor wine vat. And some of the earliest California wines came from San Juan Capistrano. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, they have not kept the legacy plants, but you can see the depiction of how the vineyards might have looked. This is a beautiful photographic exhibit on how wonderfully they've taken care of the mission. I would estimate that this is probably from the early 1900s, and this is now. And remember, this mission is a nonprofit educational corporation. So the money that people use when they go into the mission store or they buy their entry fee goes to support the mission and its educational goals. Okay, this I think would be great, and this will be the Native American part. I think this part is cool. Okay, so the Native Americans who lived here were called the Ahashiman. And please remember, when the Spanish arrived in 1769, there were approximately 80 different autonomous tribes. The group that lived here, they were hunters and gatherers. You can see that the climate was probably a lot wetter. They were fishermen. They also trapped and hunted deer and other animals. There was salmon that ran in this creek. And they built these conical homes called quichas. And they would put tule leaves on them for protection. Once the Ahashiman were baptized, they became known as the Juaneño Indians. And they really used plant life for lots of medicines, like the bay laurel was used for headaches, black sage was used for tea, black walnut, they used the nuts for protein, buckwheat was used for flour and honey. So they really knew how to use nature because that's the life they led. Once they became baptized into the Catholic faith, they left their hunting and gathering lifestyle, and sadly, the epidemic diseases brought over by the Spanish really decimated their tribe. In fact, one of the Catholic fathers sadly noted in his journal, he is signing more death certificates than birth certificates.
We've talked a lot about the history of this area, particularly with ranching and also with horses. And the mission recognizes our horses and our good friends because of the importance of horses in this whole area. In the village, we're lucky. We have our own stables. But San Juan Capistrano is rich with horses. And they were here in the beginning, and they will continue to be here until the end.
One of the most famous things about San Juan Capistrano are the famous swallows. As I said before, they are cliff swallows. They come all the way from Argentina. You can see some of their nests up there. They make their nests out of mud, and therefore swallows need a muddy area where they can grab soil and make their nests. They're very busy, busy birds. And in 1933, an American composer wrote a song called When the Swallows Come Back to Capistrano. So we will take a look at the beautiful mission.
That's the day you promised you'd come back to me. Come back to me. When you whispered Farewell in Capistrano. 'Twas the day the swallows flew out to the sea. Out to the sea. All the mission bells will ring. The chapel choir will sing. The happiness you'll bring will live in my memory. When the swallows come back to Capistrano, that's the day I pray that you'll come back to Capistrano.
Well, that's our show for today. We hope you enjoyed it. We certainly did, bringing you all this wonderful information on the California missions. I don't know about you, but every time we do our shows, I learn more and more about the state of California. But today's show was particularly important because of the heritage, the cultures, and the significance of the missions to our beautiful state of California. I'm becoming more and more historical as we go through this. I have a greater appreciation and significance, and I now understand why California is the Golden State. In the meantime, I just want to take one more opportunity to remind you of Bernie's introduction of our show today. Remember, he talked about the beginning of our mystery bus trips. That's right. We're planning to get on the road again with our bus trips. And it's going to be a mystery trip. And so we want to make sure that you're on our email list. And it's in this show, or you can just go to the website. But you've got to get on the list because Bernie's getting ready to send the details out. And you don't want to miss that email because it gives you the chance to be the first to reserve and get your seat on the bus. Now, he said it's a mystery trip. Now, keep in mind how that goes. We don't know where. We don't know when. All we know is we're planning buses. So please hurry, because I know many of you are wanting to get on the bus. You stop me all the time in the village, and I'm so glad you do. And so now we can tell you that we're planning bus trips. So watch for your email. Watch your junk mail. This shouldn't go to junk mail. So watch us and get ready to go on our mystery trips. And in the meantime, the only thing I can leave you with is, where in the world is Bernie?